she? She's over there. Okay, cool. That's great. Cool, thanks. Okay. Let me just get one more thing out, and then should we just kick start? Tell me when you're ready to get started. Okay, hello everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today at this COP27 side event here from Sharm el-Sheikh. We're going to be talking about the Glasgow pledge to end public finance for fossil fuels, scaling ambition for a just transition. Now, before we get started, I'd like to let you know that there are headsets at the back of the room for those who would like Arabic or French translation, so please do help yourselves. Now, we bring this event to you as a collaboration between Oil Change International, Recourse, Tearfund, Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and GFLAC, Grupo de Financiamiento Climático Latin America and Caribbean. Now, please, that's the first time I've said that, so hopefully the pronunciation is right, but you can collar me afterwards if not. My name is Seppi Golzari Monroe. I'm Energy Transition Director at the Global Wind Energy Council. And I'm so delighted to be here. We've got really star panel lined up for you, so thank you so much for joining us. Now, we are here to talk about FFS. And no, we're not talking about the well-known curse in the English language for F's sake. Though looking at the amount of fossil fuel support that we've seen in 2022, some of you may well be tempted to utter that curse, but please, not in front of the microphones. And no, we're talking about fossil fuel subsidies and other forms of support for fossil fuels. You know, just to provide you a little bit of context, at COP26 in Glasgow, 34 countries and 5 institutions pledged to end direct international public finance for unabated fossil fuels by the end of 2022, and prioritize their public finance fully for the clean energy transition. Now, if countries and institutions follow through on their commitment, this would directly shift $28 billion a year out of fossil fuels and into clean energy, which would help shift even larger sums of public and private finance. Now, I'll tell you why I'm particularly excited about this. Because this year, we, the global wind industry, the Global Wind Energy Council, have teamed up with the Global Solar Council, and we have our pavilion, you know, tucked away amongst all the other pavilions and in a look. But the reason I'm mentioning that is, in years past, it might have been the industry chasing engagement from governments and government representatives. But we have been overwhelmed this year with countries from across the globe approaching us and asking how they can collaborate with the industry, wind, solar in particular, both of the technologies that we know are going to lead this energy transition. And you know, that's a real shift. And I'll tell you why. It's clear from the meetings that we've been having that these countries, you know, we've had countries across Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, amongst others. They really see this not only in the climate interest, but something that aligns with their industrial aspirations, their economic development, their just transition for their workers, and you know, sustainable development as a whole. And that's really what we've been hearing from these countries. So it really would be very important to see the blockages to more investment into clean energy really being swept aside. So that's why, you know, we're really excited to take, you know, have this discussion today. So I'm going to move swiftly on to the first item on the agenda. We've got our keynote speaker here. We're absolutely delighted to have her. Her name is Vanessa Nakate. And Vanessa is a Ugandan climate justice activist and a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. She was Uganda's first youth climate justice activist and climate striker, and went on to found the Rise Up movement, a movement of young people protesting for climate action across Africa. She's also author of A Bigger Picture, My Fight to Bring New African Voice to the Climate Crisis. And I can tell you, I've looked into this, it gets fantastic star ratings on Goodreads and Waterstones. So, you know, please do dip in. But can we have a round of applause for Vanessa and welcome her to the stage?
Here we are now, coming towards the end of the second week of COP27. 2 weeks of people talking, on top of nearly 3 decades of people talking. And during that time, so many promises, so many commitments, so many pledges have been made, and yet fossil fuel emissions keep rising. And increasingly, people are paying for all of these broken promises with their livelihoods and their lives. We know many of the things that we need to do to avert the worst impacts of the climate crisis. At the top of that to-do list is to stop all new fossil fuel expansion and massively accelerate the transition to renewable energy. But there are some very powerful people here at the COP that do not want that to happen. 636 fossil fuel lobbyists are roaming around these halls, and turning COP27 into a marketing conference for oil, coal, and gas. The IEA estimates that companies like Shell, Total, and ExxonMobil will rake in $2 trillion in profits this year alone, and yet governments gave almost $700 billion in public money, our money, in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Big oil and gas corporations are making $2 trillion in windfall profits this year, and yet leaders cannot seem to find the $100 billion that was promised to climate-vulnerable countries each year by 2020. Fossil fuel companies are making $2 trillion in windfall profits this year, and we can't find the necessary funds to help people in Pakistan deal with the devastating flooding. Or the people who live in the small island states which are being swallowed by rising seas. Or the millions of people who are now facing starvation across the Horn of Africa. Does this outrage you? It outrages me. Do not tell us there is no money for a loss and damage fund. There is plenty of money for a loss and damage fund. What is lacking is political will. Just a couple of days ago, the climate minister of Sweden said, "I don't think we should develop a new fund. This outrages me." In September, I visited Turkana County in the north of Kenya. This region is in the grip of the deadliest drought in 40 years, and as a result, almost a third of its children now suffer from severe acute malnutrition. I will never forget the story of a child I saw at a hospital in Lodwar. This is the capital of Turkana County and the place where UNICEF treats the very worst cases of severe acute malnutrition. This condition is sometimes called wasting, because that is what happens to the children who suffer from it. They are quite literally wasting away before your eyes. This child's family was not able to get help in time, and when the sun set on the very day that I had met him, he died. In Glasgow, 39 countries and institutions promised that they would end international public finance for fossil fuels by the end of this year, and instead fully prioritize support for clean energy. And 1 year later, only half of the signatories with major international finance have turned their pledges into action. Germany, Italy, Canada, and the United States have yet to do so and risk breaking their promise. Germany is planning to make a dash for gas and invest in new fossil fuel development in Senegal. This outrages me. 3 decades of broken promises, 3 decades of broken commitments, 3 decades of broken pledges. I don't know what a pledge means to these leaders, but I know what it means to me. Making a pledge means taking care of your responsibilities. Making a pledge means keeping your sticking by your commitments. Making a pledge means keeping your word. And I pledge to work with young people around the world to hold these leaders accountable. I pledge to fight for every fraction of a degree. And I pledge that that little boy I met at the hospital in Lodwar will not have died in vain just so fossil fuel lobbyists and the countries that support them could stuff a little bit more money into their pockets. And I will keep my word. Thank you.
Vanessa, thank you. Thank you so much. I honestly don't know how to follow that. And it just really brings home what we're talking about here. You know, I think it speaks for itself. Vanessa, thank you so much. We're going to move on to our first panel, who are going to give us a real grounding into the context for this pledge that was made in Glasgow and what we've seen so far and where we need to go next. Please welcome Laurie Vanderberg, who co-leads Oil Change International's public finance work. Before she joined Oil Change International, she led a successful climate litigation case against Shell at Friends of the Earth. She also worked with the Overseas Development Institute on analysis and advocacy to shift public finance away from fossil fuels and towards sustainable energy. Please welcome Louise Burrows, Special Energy Advisor at the COP26 unit of the UK government. She has been leading the Clean Energy Transition Partnerships Initiative and the topic of today's discussion. She's seconded into the UK government from think tank E3G, where she was Senior Policy Advisor for E3G's Coal Transition Team and the Powering Past Coal Alliance. And last but not least, please welcome Edward Okot Omoya. He is an ICMA and IFC certified climate champion and a seasoned ESG specialist serving in different roles with international, regional, and national organizations. He is currently serving as a consultant on environmental and social management specialist at the East Africa Development Bank. Please welcome them. Thank you. Laurie, please you can start.
Yes, thanks so much. I'm just waiting for my slide deck to be put on the... Yes. Okay, I'll move over here. Let's do it this way. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how countries can deliver on the promise they made last year in Glasgow by avoiding a death for gas. As we've already heard, in Glasgow, 39 countries and institutions pledged to end international public finance for fossil fuels by the end of this year and shift this money to clean energy. Signatories included both donor countries such as France, the US and Canada, and also recipient countries including Zambia, Burkina Faso and Gabon. Together, these signatories can shift huge amounts of money out of fossil fuels and into clean. They can tip the balance in favor of clean energy and shift 28 billion a year out of fossil fuels and into clean energy, a sum that is sufficient to close the energy access gap. So under Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, countries agreed to make finance flows consistent with climate and development goals. Since then, we've seen little progress on this agenda, and here in Egypt, this topic also didn't make it into the negotiation agenda. The Glasgow Pledge could play a role in breaking this deadlock. And this is critical to keep climate goals within reach. The IEA scenario that maintains a 50% chance to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees has no investments in new oil and gas fields or in new LNG infrastructure. And these conclusions have not been altered as a consequence of Russia's horrific war in the Ukraine. The IEA says that the solutions to the energy and the climate crisis are one and the same: a faster transition away from fossil fuels and to efficient, clean, reliable and affordable energy. But OCI research shows that public finance remains skewed in favor of fossil fuels. The G20 countries and the MDBs provide $55 billion a year in public finance for fossil fuels. This is twice their support for clean energy. Most of this support now flows to gas projects, a sum that is greater than all clean energy support combined. Japan, Korea, and China are the biggest providers of public finance for fossil fuels, and they have all not pledged to end this support. Canada, Germany, Italy, and the United States have done so, but as Vanessa just said, these countries are showing concerning signs of backsliding on their pledge. Here in Egypt, we're hearing from countries and also from the lobbyists that are walking around here in the space that gas is needed as a transition fuel or for development. But our data shows that most of this public finance actually flows to high-income countries and not to low-income countries. Of the top 15 recipients of public finance for fossil fuels, there's only one that is low-income, Mozambique. And there, this money mostly flows to projects that support exports rather than domestic energy use. G20 and MDB finance only goes to energy access for 6.5%, and of that finance, only 0.5% goes to distributed renewable energy. Our data also shows that fossil fuel exclusion policies can be effective. In the last 3 years, we've seen a 36% drop in international public finance for fossil fuels. And about a quarter of this drop can be explained by new fossil fuel exclusion policies that have been adopted by the UK and the EIB, and restrictions on finance for coal-fired power. But for this decrease to be sustained and continue, we need countries to deliver on their pledge. And here you see a graph with the country-level data. So countries have an opportunity to turn this around. With a little over 1 month left till the end of 2022 deadline, 6 out of 16 countries that provide significant international public finance for energy are living up to their commitment. Denmark, the UK, the EIB, France, Finland and Sweden have policies that implement their pledge. The Netherlands and Belgium are not quite there yet, and their Glasgow pledge policies allow transition periods that breach the end of 2022 deadline. And Germany, Italy, Canada and the United States are among the countries that still need to get on track. They have yet to release updated policies. So to realize the full potential financial shift, these countries must follow best practices, meet the end of 2022 deadline, and not allow loopholes for continued investments in any long-standing fossil fuel infrastructure. And this should apply to their voting power at the MDBs, the multilateral development banks too. Signatories also have an opportunity to encourage other countries to follow suit, including by cementing these commitments at the multilateral level, such as here at the UNFCCC at COP, and also at the OECD. Signatories can and must do more to increase their clean energy finance. They should prioritize energy access and the just transition off of fossil fuels in countries that have significant dependency on fossil fuels. Any support must protect human rights and have inclusive planning processes that take leadership from local communities, workers, and local governments. By shifting out of fossil finance, countries can free up money to meet climate finance and loss and damage needs. And to avoid hypocrisy, they must also get their own house in order, including by ending domestic fossil fuel subsidies and stopping fossil fuel expansion. The Glasgow Pledge signatories have an opportunity to shift billions. They must keep momentum and not let a dash for gas get in the way of their commitments. The clock is ticking till the end of 2022 deadline, and we'll continue to keep track of implementation. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Hi, everybody. So my name's Louise Burrows, and as Seppi mentioned, I work in the UK government and in the COP unit, and I've been leading our work on the Glasgow Pledge and what we've been calling the Clean Energy Transition Partnership. So I'm here just to kind of give you insight into how the pledge actually came about and what has happened in the year since it's launched. I know I only have 5 minutes and there's a lot to talk about in that short space of time, so I'm just going to focus on a few of the key elements that have allowed us to get to where we are today. The first thing I want to mention is really about precedent setting. So over this long time period, as Larry just mentioned, we're starting to see slight reductions in fossil finance, but what we have seen a reduction in is international coal finance. A lot of people in this room here today, has done a lot of campaigning on that particular agenda. And the progress that we've seen, particularly on coal, really did act as that thin end of the wedge that opened the door to allow us to campaign on then oil and gas finance, and has really opened that up for oil and gas campaigning to be the next frontier. And the reason why I mention this is that this actually had an impact on the UK policy. So back in January 2020, UK Export Finance agreed to end international support for coal, which was a good win, even though it didn't support any coal anymore anyway. But the reason why this was interesting was because UKEF then basically showed that it can discriminate against a particular sector. And so we took that and thought, okay, we now have an opportunity to get them to do the same on oil and gas. So that kind of precedent setting can really kind of set the agenda and the direction of travel going forward. And then in March 2021, as many of you know, the UK did decide to end international public support for fossil fuels. And again, this was another major precedent, that was set, that, the UK ultimately set the gold standard of what we were expecting on this type of policy, but also really signaled that the economics of energy is changing and that future prosperity lies in clean. So I'm just going to quickly touch on that UK story, because that's part of how we got the pledge. With the UK securing its COP26 presidency, the issue then of climate leadership and credibility was at the forefront of what it needed to do. And when it secured its presidency, we just knew that we had to get our own house in order for us to genuinely try and push other countries to make ambitious climate commitments. So that was one of the key drivers as to how the UK adopted its international fossil finance policy. One of the other key drivers is also, the clear scientific and evidence base behind the changing economics of energy, and the fact that, as I mentioned, future prosperity does lie in clean. So we've been continually looking at that evidence base and updating it and using it to influence our own policy, but also to influence the policies of the signatories that we secured last year as well. So when the UK was reviewing its policy, we did analysis in London, but also with our embassies across countries which have got challenging energy contexts to look at, okay, what are the solutions to these countries' energy needs? And of course, most of the time you're coming out looking at large-scale renewables, uptake of renewables, potentially some support for gas power in those limited contexts where there's no other alternative. And so that energy base was what was used to really, evidence-based, was what really was used to define the scope of our UK policy and then to define the scope of the Glasgow pledge as well. And I think what was really helpful is that we did a lot of work with the CSO community to really align that insider and outsider advocacy. So we had the NGOs, really inputting the same messages, the same evidence into what we were doing, and also inputting that into the other signatories as well. And having us sing off the same hymn sheet is far more powerful than having distributed messages which aren't quite aligned. So that was very key. And we saw that when the UK decided to fund the gas export facility in Mozambique, which was not our finest moment, I admit, but the NGOs came down on that rightly, really hard. And that really triggered quite a heated debate internally in the UK government, where we knew that we could no longer support any other type of project like that again. So when we adopted our policy, we then wanted to internationalize that and use our COP26 presidency platform to really, get other countries to follow suit. And what we did in last year was really try to trigger a sort of domino effect of countries coming on board. So midway through the year, we knew the US was going to sign up. So we kind of used that to try and push other countries to also join. So we mentioned to Canada, have you heard that the US is actually going to sign this statement? And then Canada suddenly thinks, maybe I actually need to take this seriously. And then we hear that Canada, which is the largest international financier of fossils, or, well, hopefully historically, signed up 2 days before we launched the statement at COP26. We then used that to push the other countries to follow suit. And then we suddenly had this domino of countries signing up last year in what was a pretty exceptional 2 weeks. And we had this situation where no country wanted to be the first one to make the commitment, to then suddenly countries not wanting to be the last man standing. So it was a really interesting play of events. So what we've been doing this year since we've launched the statement is working really hard with the signatories to try and develop a truly sort of common approach to implementing the statement's commitments. It's not been easy with the invasion and the energy security crisis, but we've been holding monthly workshops, continual bilaterals. We've been going to visiting various countries to really, share lessons learned, best practice, and develop a sort of knowledge-sharing platform between the signatories to really dig into the details of how they implement these commitments. So we've been doing deep dives into how you manage industry, what is the approach to gas power, and really drip feeding that evidence base into the signatories. And what we've been trying to push for is a real evidence-based approach throughout this whole procedure, and to really move away from the ideological approaches that we've been seeing coming out of some countries. And I think that's been really crucial in terms of maintaining momentum on this throughout the year, but actually really holding the signatories to account. And I think it's been working. As Larry mentioned, we have seen new policies be adopted this year, even in this energy security crisis. And I have had guarantees from Canada, Italy, Spain, Germany, that they will be adopting new policies by the end of this year. So, and I think what else happened last year is that we had the G7 leadership also reaffirm their commitment to this agenda in June, bringing Japan on board as well. There's still a lot of work to do there in terms of getting Japan to move further. But having that reaffirmation of that commitment in what was a very turbulent year, I think just also to help demonstrate that there was real momentum behind this. So we're going to carry on. This is going to remain a priority for the UK, even with us not holding the presidency anymore. And we'll continue to work with our CSO partners to drive this forward and secure further progress. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. I'd like to now turn to Edward.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edward Okoto Moya from the East African Development Bank. It's such a delight to be with you this afternoon. I bring apologies from the Director General, who has not been able to come and represent the bank at this wonderful platform. However, I'm here to represent the bank. Yesterday, we celebrated the anniversary of the public statement that we signed at Glasgow. However, the bank signed it consciously because, as a development financial institution, our vision is to be a partner of choice in promoting sustainable socio-economic development. So what have we so far done as a result? As a financial institution within the East African region, we are already working on modifying our climate change policy. Our climate change policy will include all the aspects of the new statement that we have signed. When we signed that statement, we hadn't, and we have never financed any oil and gas-related projects in Uganda or within the region. So our position is clear. Now that we have signed, we are not going back. We will continue with our commitment to the pledge. And we are already working closely with the UK government. Our commitment is to get all the bank staff trained on how to implement it, because capacity building is a necessity. We need everyone to know how to adapt, because it's a new development. We need the technology. We need the innovation. In Africa, we have the potential. The renewable energy potential is vast. In East Africa alone, we have the solar energy potential, we have the wind power, we have the green hydrogen potential. So if we shift from the fossil fuels to such renewable energy sources, we will be amazed at how we will protect our planet. So as a bank, we are committed to doing just that. We want to do the right thing. And we also call upon the international financial institutions who have signed to this statement and are not doing it right. They are still doing other dirty business to really work consciously following their integrity. I know they have their core values. One of their core values may be honesty and integrity. They need to comply. They need to support this initiative. People are dying all over the world because of climate impacts. In East Africa, where I come from, Vanessa has just mentioned what is happening in northern Kenya. The drought killing people. When you look at Karamoja region, for example, we also had famine. Statistics are there. When you look at eastern Uganda, we have had extreme weather conditions, floods and landslides, mudslides. When you go down to western Uganda, you see people dying because of the same landslide, mudslides, floods. So what must we do as a development financial institution? We know the risks are there in financing, but we need the finances to flow to the south. We need to support our clients, the clients who are already working with us should be trained on how to transition. They need to make their projects energy efficient. They need to make their projects climate smart. So with that, I call upon all the other people, all the other partners who haven't signed up to this statement to do so. And as a bank, we were the first financial institution to sign up to the statement. So it would be a very good stimulus package for us to go back with not less than $100 million to Africa to support the East African region in our just transition to renewable energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Edward. And another difficult set of speeches to follow. And I think, Edward, it came out really strong and clear, the call on the other financial institutions to follow their integrity. And I think that really speaks to this, this audience and this panel in this moment. And thank you so much for that. I think it was also fascinating to hear from Louise about the virtuous cycle that she's seen between what can happen on the international stage when the civil society groups work to push with governments, with the presidencies for a particular outcome, and the response at the national level is really fascinating. And Laurie, I really was fascinated to see the numbers of countries who are still missing with their policies. Not naming any names, but naming names, obviously, particularly the Canadians, the US and Germany. So, have that noted. We're going to go to watch a short video now. Following that, we've got a really exciting panel for you next. We've heard about the basis of this pledge and the how it came about and why it's important and where we're at. And next, after this video, we're actually going to hear from people in these communities showing the impact on communities of fossil fuel financing. So just bear with us, and we're going to get that video on for you right now. Thank you.
because of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, Africa has become a hot cake for extractive activities, especially gas extraction. When there is a shortage in Europe, Africa bears the brunt. I work with various communities in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, and among one of those communities is the Ogoni land that has been impacted for the past 56 years of oil extraction. And all across the Niger Delta aside, the Ogoni land has been really impacted by extractive activities. And when you go to these lands, you feel as though you are actually seeing people dying by their numbers. And then because of the impacts of the extractive activities, the life expectancy in that region for now is about 45 years.
So we came here today to demand rich countries to stop funding fossil fuel. The climate crisis it's getting severe day by day, and especially people in the global south affected the most, despite they contributed to the crisis the least. Despite the government, rich countries are financing fossil fuel with public money, but they are not delivering the money for where most needed. Like there are negotiations going on loss and damage finance. People are already suffering from the impact quite strongly, but they don't have money. And developed countries agreed to deliver 100 billion climate finance, but this promise hasn't been met. So and we need renewable energies for energy transitions, but they finance more fossil fuel than renewable energy. So they should shift these monies from funding fossil to renewable energies.
One of the largest gas reserves found anywhere in the world in the last 10 years has been found off the coast of northern Mozambique. And the rich countries are all out to grab that. All the rich countries are putting in financing into that project. It is devastating people's lives. 550 families have been displaced. People who rely on the land and the sea to survive have been dispossessed of their lands, have been dispossessed of their access to the sea. This is what gas is doing to the people of Mozambique, and we say no. We say no to this. We say no to the global north countries financing fossil fuel disaster in our countries. We have solutions. We want renewable energy, community-based renewable energy with our principles. That means the renewable energy also should not rob someone else to be able to give energy to people, and energy for people first who have never had energy.
We are done with a lot of talking. We need actions. Action needs to be put in place. Action needs to be put in place. So it's high time they put their mouths where their money belongs.
Developed countries don't face this reality. If they see it, they cannot finance fossil fuel anymore.
It's an excellent prelude to the next panel that we've got for you. And as I mentioned already, this takes us right back to the human level, really the community level, to hear from people on the ground about how fossil fuel financing is impacting on them. So I'd like to welcome our first panelist. We have Promise Salawu, Project Officer, Tearfund Nigeria. Promise is an activist working with young people and grassroots community in the Middle Belt and northeast of Nigeria, and he's passionate about climate justice and poverty alleviation for those vulnerable communities. And at Tearfund, he oversees 7 environmental and economic sustainability projects, and he's going to be talking on our panel today. We've also got Aaron Pedrosa from the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. Aaron is a public interest lawyer who assists in a pro bono capacity for amongst others, such as farmers and workers. He also represents fossil fuel affected communities in the Philippines. And he's currently representing 19 affected communities in relation to 19 coal plants funded by the World Bank's private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation. And last but not least, we have Diana Cardenas, General Coordinator at the Grupo de Financiamiento Climático Latin America and Caribbean. Diana has more than 10 years' experience as a consultant on sustainability and climate finance issues, and she has led the work of GFLAC in tracking the financial flows from public and private banks in Latin America in all aspects of the energy transition. So please welcome our next panel. And I'll turn to you first, Promise.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. I want to start by saying that it is no doubt that Africa has a huge potential for renewable energy. But unfortunately, we still have over 600 million people in Africa who lack access to energy. I live in Nigeria, in Plateau State in Nigeria, and interestingly, we have about 50 to 60% of the population of Nigeria connected to the national grid. Now, out of the 50 to 60%, we have about 80% of that population who also have alternative powers apart from the national grid. Of course, we know what the power is, diesels and petrol generators. Now, for a country like Nigeria, it is alarming that the future of the country itself depends on fossil fuel, right? We know that Nigeria is an oil-producing country, but not that we do not completely have renewables in the country, but they are at very small scales, scales that do not measure up to the demand of the country. We also know that Nigeria is a fast developing country when it comes to population. It's growing really, really fast. And we can almost say the same thing about the entire continent of Africa. Now, the public finance we are asking for clearly can solve this problem. We need to move from small scale to large scale renewable energy systems. Right now, because we do not have the finance, most of the companies and firms that already existing doing this work cannot expand. And because they cannot expand, it's very difficult to have the kind of reach that they should be having. And of course, so this money is critical, it's important for that kind of scale of expansion. The second part of it is that power transmission generally in big countries are a big problem. In Nigeria this year alone, the national grid has collapsed over 3 times. And when the national grid collapses, what it means is that it's a national blackout, isn't it? But if we begin to talk about transition, we're emphasizing more on mini grids, off-grid mini grid systems that brings the power solution to the communities themselves. Rather than transfer the power to them, give them the power themselves. Let them have access to power. I'm pretty sure we know that this financing will go a long way to establish such mini grids. In connecting this, I just want us to know that it is not just power that will become accessible to the people. We also have green jobs. We know that the future of fossil fuel, jobs in fossil fuel is really low. And research has shown that we have a great fall, over 75% in fossil fuel by 2050. That shows that there's a great opportunity for a huge demography of young people in Africa who do not have access to jobs and livelihoods. And so renewable energy gives them such platforms, such opportunities. And I believe very strongly that this can be made possible. recently, we had a very small project in the northeast of Nigeria where we trained young people on how to use e-waste materials to construct inverters, to construct charge controllers, and we taught them how to install. And we installed a solar system in a local clinic. This clinic have been without power for the past 3 years and only rely on generators. But with our small intervention, as small as it is unbelievable the appreciation we got from that community. That community is grateful for the small work we did, but beyond that is that we have 10 young people now who are informed, who are skillful, who now have a source of livelihoods from installing solar and maintaining solar systems. For me, that is huge. And we are calling on people and all the wealthy countries to consider not just stopping the funding, public funding of fossil fuel, but really we need to consider scaling up massively, particularly in Africa, renewables. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Promise. We'll turn to Aaron now.
Yes, hello. 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 Good afternoon, everyone. Yes. Let me tell you about the Philippines. The Philippines is an archipelagic country located in the Southeast Asia region, and it is home to 115 million Filipinos. If you look at its vulnerability to the climate crisis, it is mainly because it is found in the typhoon highway, as we call it. It is next to the warmest ocean, and it is the next to the fastest rising ocean among the other seas. It's 4 times faster compared to the others. It is also located in the Pacific Rim of Fire. It is likewise a country where you find 60% of its population whose income is below the poverty threshold. Right now, inflation is 7.7%. 70% of our population is located along our coastlines. And because of the climate crisis, recent studies have shown that around 74 million Filipinos by 2030 will be affected by sea level rise. Every year, we are hit by an average of 20 to 21 typhoons, of which 5 have been projected to be super typhoons. This year alone, in less than 1 month, the Philippines was battered by 3 super typhoons. In less than a decade, 2013, we were hit by Super Typhoon Haiyan, which was considered the strongest typhoon to make landfall in recorded history. Last year, another super typhoon trudged along the path of Typhoon Haiyan, affecting millions of Filipinos. We were recently hit by another severe typhoon. It's not even a super typhoon. And of our 18 regions, 17 were affected. Imagine our vulnerability to the climate crisis. Yet, we do not contribute as much as the global north in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. While the fact remains that our contribution may be negligible, it is not really insignificant because it is 0.4% compared to the global emissions. That is significant from our own standpoint. You see fossil fuel expansion on top of the 30 existing coal plants and 5 fossil gas or LNG plants existing. There are 24 more in the pipeline, excluding LNG terminals, which includes 1 supported or funded by Shell, UK, ironically, who hosted the Glasgow COP last year. And the rapid push for fossil gas expansion in the Philippines is a reflection of the intent to expand fossil gas rather, in our region. And it is happening in the Philippines, Indonesia, and I think the other one is Malaysia. Vietnam, sorry. And we could only surmise that there's this rabid push for fossil gas because of the financial flows coming from financial institutions and their financial intermediaries. Let me tell you about the 19 coal plants at a time when the World Bank said it will no longer finance greenfield coal plants except on exceptional cases back in 2013, the same year we were hit by Haiyan. They used financial intermediaries to fund 19 coal plants. And now we have 24 fossil gas plants in the pipeline. Where do these corporations, the bank, where do these fossil fuel corporations get the tenacity to pursue their fossil fuel investments and portfolios? It is because the support remain. That is why we remind the global north with their corporations, with their financial intermediaries, that commitments to future fossil fuel investments is good, but a rethinking of its current portfolio is a necessity if it were to ensure the survival of communities, of countries of the global south, like the Philippines. Because of the lack of clarity on that regard, we remain in the front lines of the disasters. And that means, and that spells, not only loss in terms of income, homes, and livelihoods, but lives as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Now we'll turn to Diana.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, representing the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean, and you said it really well in Spanish. So kind of you to say it in Spanish. Okay, I wanted to share with you a bit of also the reality in Latin America. So the latest IPCC report already acknowledged, and we are seeing day on all the impacts climate change is already having in our world. Latin America and the Caribbean is not the exception. We are suffering from impacts from floods, extreme weather events, drought, as much as any other region, with differences, obviously, as the Caribbean region can be a much more vulnerable sub-region in Latin America. And at the same time, in the other side of the equation, we see fossil fuels are being funded, have been funded, continue to be funded by key players in the economic, monetary, and financial system. Banks have had a key role in that sense. We have been working with the Climate Finance Group in Latin America to track those financial flows, to see how they're arriving to the region to finance a just energy transition or otherwise. The reality, our number shows until 2021, counting from 2016, post-Paris Agreement, we see the big share fossil fuels have 3 times more than renewables have had. And this is the case also at the national level, looking at numbers in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico. And this is important to say, and to see numbers is always good to support an argument, especially when there are money. But the reality on the ground is really what matters in this situation. Communities, local communities are being impacted by these investments. Women, indigenous, are fighting, are at the front line of these issues because their lives are being affected their children are getting sick because nature, their home, our home, has been destroyed. Fossil fuels have no argument anymore to keep receiving this amount of money today. With everything we know, with what science is telling us, there is really no argument that can support the expansion of fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency said in a report that from 2021 we were not supposed to keep investing in new fossil fuel projects. That's not the case. And that means we're not on a trajectory to arrive to our goal, the goal we are here for, which is to limit global temperature to 1.5. And I say also that there is no argument to keep funding fossil fuels, also because of the costs. If you compare what the costs in reality, not in the numbers being used to support business cases, but the real cost, social and environmental as well, shows that there's really no business case out of fossil fuel projects. Just to give you a concrete example, the Vaca Muerta project in Argentina, you just look it up on Google and you'll find plenty of information about that one. And that project, with partners, we just found out that if you compare the costs, but the real costs of this project, you arrive to a number of 5,637 billion in costs, liability costs of that project, compared to 420 billion of the Argentinian debt. So you see those numbers and you say, okay, so this project is really costing this much liability. Then you see how you really have no argument to keep investing in that. And on the other side of the equation, I also want to mention something that's quite important. And Promise was mentioning some very specific examples of what needs to be done on the other side. On one side, we're talking about stopping fossil fuel finance, right? But where does that money need to go then? Well, that money needs to go to renewables, that's for sure. I think we all agree here in the panel that that's the way to go. But we need to be very careful on how we also do this transition to renewables, because talking about large scale, what you were mentioning, Promise, and I was glad you mentioned in the end about distributed energy systems and arriving to communities, because large scale can be also an issue when you see, for example, the reality in Latin America with large scale hydro. Large scale hydro has big impacts and has impacted also indigenous communities in many places, including my own home country, Ecuador, that's fighting also for oil extraction. We need to be careful to find the solutions, but be careful with the narrative about false solutions as well, and be very attentive to ensure that the transition is also made considering the reality and the impacts on communities, for it to be not only a transition, but a just transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Another, some very sobering stories there. I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So if give you an opportunity to have a think and possibly raise your hand. There'll be a microphone that will come to you. But in the meantime, I'm just going to pose some discussion questions to our panel. And I'd like to start with you, Aaron. What do you see as the next steps for the Glasgow statement based on your experience in the Philippines?
Yes, hello. As I've mentioned earlier, we welcome the commitment made at Glasgow and the fact that there is now an addition. From 39, we have 41. But there has also, there needs to be a position by the signatories, not only for future investments, but also in the direction of phasing out of its current fossil fuel portfolio, both at home and abroad, those financed by corporations of these countries, as well as those coming in through intermediated finance. And if we are to push the argument further, the Glasgow commitment should not just should not settle for fossil fuel investment. It should also position itself in support of climate finance, finance for loss and damage, finance for mitigation, finance for adaptation. Because this is the imperative of the day. And the commitment would remain just a commitment on paper if it is not based on science. Science dictates, climate science dictates, that greenhouse gas emissions, global greenhouse gas emissions, should peak by 2025. And the imperative of the day is not just stopping new investments, but stopping those that are existing, decommissioning them now in favor of rapid, equitable, and just transition towards renewable energy systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Are there any questions from the floor? If not, I'll continue. Oh, there's a lady there in the yellow shirt, and then after her, a gentleman with glasses and suits behind her. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really interesting and inspiring presentations. I have a question about, so you have been focusing mostly on subsidies for production, right? Fossil fuel production or infrastructure. But what about fossil fuel consumer subsidies that have been ramped up quite a bit in recent months because of the war in Ukraine? I think all over the world. I know European governments are sort of scrambling to find more sort of help for consumers to sort of make sure that this energy insecurity and the price increases is not sort of endangering their political futures. So, and I know that, typically those things are considered separately, but if the consumer subsidies are ratcheting up, and if there's more demand for fossil fuels, then there's going to be maybe more demand for fossil fuel production, right? I think those two are very much connected, and I wonder if sort of separating them is a useful sort of way of looking at this issue. I mean,
Thank you so much. That's a really interesting question. I'd like to turn to Laurie to answer that, please.
Yeah, thanks. A very important question. So the OECD tracks fossil fuel subsidies. So we're talking here about international public finance flows, but next to providing international public finance for the energy sector, there are also significant domestic subsidies that flow to the energy sector. And the latest OECD research on this topic shows that these domestic fossil fuel subsidies are over $700 billion a year. And the research also shows that this is almost a doubling in 2021 compared to the previous year. And we're expecting that these numbers will rise further, indeed, because of the rising energy prices linked to the war in Ukraine. So it's really important that we don't just tackle international public finance for fossil fuels, but also tackle domestic subsidies. And I think that these topics are very, very linked. It is the case that currently households are really struggling to pay their energy bills, and it's really important that governments provide targeted support to households so that they can make ends meet. But fossil fuel subsidies are not the most efficient way or effective way to do so, because often those end up mostly, or for the largest parts, in the pockets of rich households rather than low-income households. So we already heard in the keynote from Vanessa Nakate that the oil and gas industry is now making massive windfall profits, 2 trillion US dollars this year. So a much more effective way to support households through this crisis would be to tax those profits and use that revenue to support, provide targeted support to those that need it most. Thanks for your question.
Thank you very much, Laurie. And there was a gentleman behind that lady that, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I commend all the panelists for the presentations. I have a question directed to Edward. I'm from Uganda, by the way. Yes, thank you for the very bold commitments on championing investments in green energy alternatives. So my question is, given that, of course, we can't discuss energy transition within the East African context without taking into account, of course, issues of livelihoods and also the economy, etc., which I believe you're very much familiar with. So what would need to happen, given that you're taking very bold steps as a financial institution to commit to financing green energy initiatives? So what would need to happen to make the case for that delicate balance, or rather for make the case for investments, to make it scalable to invest in renewables in the East African region, given that right now, of course, there's a lot of focus on fossils and trying to, as an emerging sector in the region. But what's the one thing that needs to happen so that even other financial institutions can be able to come on board and invest in greener options? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Edward, would you like to take that question?
Yes, thank you very much, my brother. In East Africa and in Uganda, for example, there is the quest for the oil and gas as opposed to the green financing. However, as a bank, as we have already signed up to the transition, we are encouraging all our projects to be renewable energy related. And how do we encourage that? We know there are risky projects. We need to de-risk the projects. We need to get financial mechanisms that can really motivate the clients to come up and get the right funding. Because when we don't support them on the renewable energy scale, then we are not doing enough to help them. So in Uganda and in East Africa as a whole, we are committed to helping out. And we are going to help them out by using our policy that we are going to have the training on, because it's still a process. The process we are on with the UK government is to receive the training. So the training will motivate even the bank staff to help in bringing on board the right clients. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Edward. Did I see another hand going up? This gentleman in the white shirt, and then if we've got a bit more time, this gentleman in the cream hat. And I'm afraid these will have to be our last two questions. If you could keep your remarks short.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I really enjoyed the conference. One thing is international public subsidies. The other is what they just mentioned, which is domestic consumption. But what we are seeing is that oil and gas is starting to move now into plastics, because they are closing the door in many areas, but they're trying to, in a very sneaky way, get into plastics. So can you give us some ideas on how to stop this, or how this should be addressed? Thank you very much.
Is there anyone that would like to take the question on the panel? Louise?
I can try. I don't follow the plastics industry as much as I would like, but I think in terms of trying to think about the future of this coalition and how we want to take it forward, it's one thing working with the signatories on implementation around international public finance, but we're also trying to think about how can we be using the group collectively to raise ambition elsewhere. So we're looking at the MDBs, the OECD, export credit agencies, but also the scope creep around plastics and trying to set the right standards across the board in terms of other areas of fossils. So yes, this has been looking at the fossil fuel energy sector to start, but there is longer term ambitions to think about how we can use this to influence other industries and sectors as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to raise. Could you possibly pass the microphone to this gentleman at the front?
Hi, my name is Martin Vernon. I'm from Ireland, from FASTA and Future Proof Clear. I was listening to the previous presentation where the Portuguese minister was talking about making some very progressive moves, but amongst the things that he said was that they were not going to phase out fossil fuel subsidies until 2030, and I wonder why people who are moving forwards and can see what needs to be done are not moving quicker. Why are they not shutting off fossil fuel subsidies immediately?
Is there anyone who'd like to take that? Laurie, perhaps? Or
yeah, I think that this is something that we're seeing in many countries, that there are some steps that are taking in the right direction on a certain agenda, but then at the same time, on a parallel agenda, we see countries taking 2 steps back or not moving forward. So also when we look at the signatories of the Glasgow Pledge, a lot of the signatories are now looking at how they can adjust their policies so that they restrict international finance for fossil fuels, but they are not at the same time also addressing their domestic fossil fuel subsidies. So there is a clear policy incoherency there. And I think one of the ways in which we can explain this incoherency and in which we can explain this inconsistent approach is that there is a very strong fossil fuel lobby that is really interested to protect their interests, and that has quite a significant power and quite a good access also to the governments that are creating the policies. And that's also what we've seen in research looking at fossil fuel subsidies, that one of the major obstacles to removing them is actually the power of the vested industries and them actually actively trying to block any action to remove these subsidies. So the evidence is very clear that it's in the interest of economies to remove these subsidies, that it's in the interest of protecting health, that it's the interest of freeing up money that can then be redirected elsewhere, so to the education system or to the health system. And it's often really the vested interest and the political power of the incumbents that is seen as a major obstacle to remove these subsidies. So that's something that we really need to address.
Thank you very much, Laurie, and it's a really good note to end this section on the power of the fossil fuel lobby. As was mentioned by Vanessa at the beginning, 632, and that's the ones that we've managed to identify, let alone any others that have snuck in amongst delegations. So the power is strong, it's there, they're not interested in going away, and I think that it just makes these types of initiatives and being really bold and robust in calling it out even more vital. So thank you very much indeed for our part. I'm so sorry that we can't take any more questions because we're really delighted to have fantastic speaker to make some closing remarks. I'd like to welcome to the stage Laurence Toubiana. Laurence is the Chief Executive of the European Climate Foundation. In addition to her role at ECF, she is the chair of the Board of Governors of the French Development Agency and a professor at Sciences Po in Paris. And before joining ECF, which is, probably how most of you will know her, Laurence was France's climate change ambassador and special representative at COP21 in Paris and a key architect of the landmark Paris Agreement. So if you could put your hands together, please, for Laurence.
Thank you for the invitation. Listening to what I could grab of your reflection, it's true, it's a very systemic problem. And when I look, you know, I'm an old-timer of this negotiation of climate change, as you said. And you know, the oil and gas sector, they are always there. And sometimes, of course, we make progress, and then they mobilize again even more. I can tell you an anecdote. As a professor at Sciences Po, I have a really bright colleague who was the dean of the School of International Public Affairs at Sciences Po. And in January 2009, he told me, you know, Laurence, it seems that your climate action is really frightening the oil and gas sector. And they organized a sort of crisis task force to prepare for this climate. Copenhagen 2009 should be the moment where we should have had, of course, a global agreement. So January, they were concerned, and they wanted to really have a crisis room to deal with that. That was January. And then, end of June, he calls me and tells me, you know, Laurence, I think your thing is not going too well because they have dismantled their crisis room. So they are not anxious anymore. So, you know, they are always there. Unfortunately, it went badly at Copenhagen. And by the way, as another anecdote, we had another interview. We did a film on the Battle of Climate, which is now in France, but will be circulated later on. And you see the lobbyist interview a very straightforward lobbyist talking in front of the camera, talking about how they organize to prepare and to destabilize the scientific community, the people, because they know how to do that. So one thing, yes, it's a systemic addiction we have to fossil fuel. It's normal that we have built all the second industrial revolution on that. So it's a fight, and it's everywhere. Chemicals, plastics, of course, oil and gas, but it is many more things. And we don't see even very often where if you take one point out, the other ones are coming back. So it's just normal. We have to keep fighting, and we have to take this bit by bit. So I totally recognize what you are doing, and I think the pledge is really important. But of course, it will not solve all, but it will enter and close one door, and we will have to close many more doors. And they will always be behind the door trying to push it. So that's life, and it has never been easy, but we have to continue nevertheless. And I think Glasgow, and then nowadays we are close to a tipping point on that, and we saw that some countries have decided to really stop their fossil fuel subsidies. And before Glasgow, it was a big fight. UK has really done a very good job to gather a number of other countries. And when you look at the countries that have signed up to stop international financing of oil and gas and fossil fuel in general, the list is still small, but there are very interesting participants like the East Africa Development Bank. And we have, of course, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, France now. It has been very difficult for the French system. You know that. They were not the most rapid, but now they are in and they have doubled down, which is really good. And of course, UK and the EIB was early on the first MDB that has decided to be very clear on that. So I think it's possible, and really it would be very good to, of course, finish the job and have more countries align with that, and in again making the difference between fossil fuels. You know, the problem of the impact of energy prices on low-income households and the fossil fuel subsidy, notion. You see that all the time. Oh, yes, you want to get rid about fossil fuel subsidies, but what happened with the people who cannot afford to pay the bill? Just taking the example of France, I don't remember the numbers for UK, they're just big, but France, only 2022, almost 40 billion spent to subsidize the consumption of fossil fuel, with no targeting on low-income households for the moment. 40 billion is almost the total amount of the money that the European Recovery Fund, the Next Generation Fund, has given to France to accelerate the transition. So it's just incommensurate. You cannot do, on one side, locking in people in the fossil fuel system, and at the same time, pretending that you are doing, and where's the money for the investment anymore? So I think this is really urgent. We disconnect the economy of the fossil fuel and our addiction to that, and the money we're spending in it, to the problem of the bills and the sustainability of income and consumption of the low-income houses. That's not the same question. Response, tax the windfall profit if needed, and it's needed these days, but not pretend that we need the consumption subsidy to maintain these very high level profits. So I think it's difficult, as you said, there are so many now in the corridor, and just you see them more and more every year. So please, maybe a charter or something of principle of participation to the COPs and the conflict of interest could be maybe interesting. I know that some people are working on that. And it's really important to not to be locked in for, again, a new generation on fossil fuel investment in infrastructure. So I do think that Glasgow pledge signatories, that makes a difference. Committing to shift, it's an important amount, 28 billion a year in international public finance from fossil to clean. And they must do so because we have to create the trust, in particular in developing countries, who still depend on, for their fiscal resource, on oil and gas exports. They have to find a solution to compensate for that. And that, in my view, if we keep doing that, this has already had a domino effect on the other government and the private sector alike. The report, which now, of course, the numbers you see all the time, that we have to reach 4 trillion in clean energy investment by 2030 to get on track for 1.5 degrees C. Shifting those investments can help. It's a no-brainer return on the 28 billion and saving enormous amount of GDP in climate impacts around the world. Again, when you look at the European bill on energy these days, you see that renewable energy has saved an enormous amount of money if we had to import that part in gas or oil to produce the electricity or the heating we need. So it's really so rational, so logical, but of course, the oil and gas sector is able to portray things very differently. We will be losing jobs, we will, of course, that's not climate justice, that's a new thing, or that will be, of course, impacting low-income households. So that's a very complicated question these days because we feel this tension and this mistrust between developing countries and developed one. And there is no other solution to be committed to international solidarity if we want to get there. So stopping and cutting the addiction to fossil fuel means that we have to be much more serious on international solidarity. We cannot do one and ignore the second pillar of that. So I think we have heard how finance for fossil fuel projects is affecting local communities. Just think about the human and environment cost of the big pipeline in the Bassin, in the Congo Basin. And in a way, we know that energy production close to communities is the solution we should be looking for. And it's not that costly to do that. So there is, if the countries don't deliver on the climate pledge, there is really a credibility problem. And citizens now are noticing, at least in Europe, people are very worried about what is happening in climate. And if EU countries are signing new gas deals and new investment in gas infrastructure, I think we will not more lead by example. So I think that will be, in my view, a very tense situation politically in our countries. And I think we should have the other European countries signing up, but Japan, South Korea. South Korea decided to stop the funding on coal. That's good, but that's not enough. So I think we are winning the argument. Again, if so many lobbyists are there, it's because they are worried. So that's a good sign. But then we have to keep fighting because they can find another door, which we have not identified yet, but we should be very, very careful about that. So we have no choice to keep fighting. We have really to think very seriously about the justice element, the fair transition. Again, there is very few examples of oil and gas export in developing countries that has provided safety, security, access to energy, and well-being. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. It is concentrated income, in a way, sometimes corruption, it's interesting that probably only Norway could manage this resource, but it was already a very rich country. And the economists know that these resources are really a curse, not a benefit. But of course, that's why international solidarity is much needed. Thank you, et bon courage.
Thank you very much for that, Laurence. A really fitting way to end this excellent panel. I just want to extend my thanks to such a fantastic panel, and Vanessa, who was here earlier, who I was left speechless after her speech, and I'm just so feel really privileged to be able to have moderated this panel with you all. So thank you very much indeed. Just one more round of applause, please, for wonderful speakers.